Hey, hello everyone, and welcome to Extreme Graphics Tech. My name is Angelo, and it's been a while since I have uploaded a video. But however, today I want to talk about what you see in the title of the video, and I'm sorry if it's a little bit over the top, but I think it leaves the message as clear as possible. I have spoken about this before, but because we have grown ever since, and this is something that is constant in the channel, I think is a good opportunity to talk about it again. Okay, and it's about bottlenecks, but especially about bottleneck calculator pages, because with the videos I'm making, like, is the RX 58 5700 or 580 good in 2024 and things like that, people always come asking things like, is this CPU good enough for this GPU, right? And sometimes I'm surprised because they use quite potent or good CPUs like the 5600G from AMD, which is a very good CPU, especially considering that you are asking for like an RX 580. So when people start asking, and there are answers from other people saying things like, oh, well, at 1080p you be good, but at 4040p you're going to have 15% of bottleneck. And I am really confused when they start using percentage to say how much bottleneck you're going to have, because what does that mean exactly, and where do you get these numbers from? So as it happens, people apparently are using some things called bottleneck calculator websites, and one of the most famous, most known is exactly called bottleneck calculator, which you select the two components like CPU and GPU, and we know that not the only things that factor into the performance, but those are the two they use. And then you select the resolution, and then it's going to tell you how much bottleneck percentage you have, which is quite weird, okay? Because I don't think it makes sense. To begin with, what exactly means bottleneck, right? And for that, I'm going to use exactly a bottle, in this case, a Dove beer bottle. So a bottleneck, essentially, as you can see, is a shorter pot, okay? So you have, let's say, water flowing, and it's fully filling this bottle over here. When it gets here, you have less space for the water to flow, so it becomes a bottleneck because it's probably going to stop the movement of the water here and then make it harder for it to move, losing some of the capacity that you had initially. So essentially, what you are talking about when you talk about bottlenecks on PC is that you want your CPU to be able to saturate your GPU or vice versa. And of course, if we go to the extremes, we know that this makes no sense. Like, for example, using a Celeron CPU with an RTX 4090, or the other way around, like using a 4900K with a GTX 1050 Ti. You are putting two very unbalanced components. We know this because they are on the extremes here. But when they're closer together, things are not as simple or easy because things are not as clear. For example, what I mean with this is, if you have components that are sort of similar, let's say like an RX 7600 as a CPU, okay, and maybe, I don't know, 4070. Some people may say that the CPU is too weak, or that for that GPU. But is that really the case? It will depend. You cannot make these sorts of assumption and conclusions without understanding more about it. It's not just about the CPU and GPU, because if you are playing, for example, you have an RTX 4090 and a 7950X 3D. Those are two of the most of the fastest components you can get right now, CPU and GPU, right? Well, what if you were playing at a 1080p 60 Hz monitor? Then you say, yeah, you have very well balanced system, but your monitor is not capable of taking advantage of that. So the bottleneck is no longer your CPU and GPU, is the monitor, right? Because you cannot play those, at 1080p 60 Hz, you're not going to get advantage of either the CPU or the GPU. Or that's what you would think. But then I tell you, well, the thing is, I'm playing Cyberpunk, Path Trace at 1080p native because I don't like DLSS. And the story changed a lot, because then that game is probably going to be running around 60 or 70 FPS at 1080p, because you're playing path trace on a 4090, and that's what you play. And all of a sudden, your monitor, CPU, GPU are not longer a bottleneck, because that game is requiring so much power to run at the quality you want that the bottleneck has essentially become the software. So it's not the same, right? On the other side of the spectrum, you could say, well, I have a very well balanced system, but I want to play at 240 Hz and 4K, and I am playing with the RTX 2060 Super, right? You'll say you will never be able to move that game with that GPU at that resolutions and frame rate, right? And then the bottleneck is not longer your monitor, it's your GPU, for example. But that story changes if they tell you, where I'm playing Dota at 10, I'm playing Dota on low settings. I don't know how fast it will go, but what I mean is, in this case, the bottleneck doesn't seem so obvious, because that game will run very fast on that GPU, even at that resolution and those frame rates. So maybe you are able to get away with 240 Hz 4K while playing Dota on low. So there is a lot of factors here that you cannot just say is going to be a bottleneck just because your CPU, GPUs don't seem to be very well balanced. So considering all these factors, how can you make a calculator that is going to tell me that how much, what combination is, and how you are going to get bottleneck? So I put together on my test bench a combination that I went to check on the website just to bring you examples of that. And so what I did was I put a 13700K and an RTX 2060 Super and went to the calculator. And it told me that at 1080p I had 0% of bottleneck, which, what does that mean exactly? Because as we are going to say, that makes no sense. But the worst part is that when I went and checked at 1440p and the system kept saying I was not going to have any bottleneck. How is it possible to be a 0% bottleneck at 1080p and 0% bottleneck at 1440p when it's supposed that you are making the resolution higher, and you am I going to get the exact same frame rate then as 1080p? That's not possible. That's impossible. The moment you up the resolution, you're going to get less performance. So why there is no bottleneck? What is this thing calculating? What are you trying to achieve? How is it at 60 FPS, and that's how you measure bottleneck? And what kind of quality is this, with or without ray tracing? Am I using DLSS or not? So all of this make absolutely no sense, right? But then when you put it at 4K, it tells you that you're going to have 16% bottleneck. What the hell does that 60% bottleneck means? So if by any logic metric, you will say, well, if it means 60%, it means that at 1080p, if you get 100 frames per second, then at 4K, you're going to get 16% less frames, because now we have 16% bottleneck that we didn't have at 1080p. So that means that we are going from 100 frames to, I don't know, 80 frames per second. And you say, okay, is that really it? Because 1080p is 2 million pixels and 4K is 8 million pixels. How is it that going 4 times more pixels is only going to result in a net bottleneck of 16%? What the hell are you? What is this? Or is because you are comparing Cyberpunk or Path Trace against Dota and then you're making an average? So it makes no sense, because it's not going to give you the information you're looking for, because it's not asking about the games, how you're going to use it, what frame rate, what resolution, and so on. Is it ray trace? Is it ultra? Is it medium? How are you going to play this? So these calculators are completely useless. And to show you that, I'm going to test this exact same combination that I put in here, a different resolution, different situation, just to make it easier to understand what I'm trying to explain here. So the first thing I do is to try to find out how many FPS can I get from the CPU on Doom Eternal, for example. And I see that using 640 by 480 at low, I can get above 500 FPS and above 300, around 400, well, even 500 sometimes, but around above 400 while using the Nightmare preset and using the DLSS performance. This is to give the CPU, the GPU the best chance However, we can see that the GPU was a limiting factor even then. However, still we know it's at least 500 FPS, right? Well, the moment I put 1080p, the game goes down to less than 300 FPS. That means there is a bottleneck by the GPU. The moment you lose 200 FPS, because if I had a 4080, I would probably be able to play at 500 FPS, then it means that the GPU is bottlenecking me. So I am not quite sure where this website gets that you are not bottlenecking by using this combination. Even if this is an average of many games, it makes no sense in this case. However, we can see that you could say, well, 240 FPS is more than enough, and maybe that's the target that the website is pointing to, or the way they calculate. But this is, still, those are arbitrary numbers. We are not sure or how are they deciding these sort of things. But well, still trying. If we go to Nightmare, we see that we go under 250 FPS. So as you can see, things change depending on how you play. We're keeping the same resolution, but we are changing the settings. We are now even having less FPS than before, and less than half of what we initially had at 40 by 480 on the CPU. So how is this limitation or bottlenecking being counted is something that we have no idea. We have no relation, but the truth is that as you saw at the beginning, the CPU was being used around 50%, and now it's only 23%. So we have lose, because the GPU is limiting the CPU, around 25% utilization on the CPU. So when we go to 1440p, we have even less CPU utilization, and of course a lot less FPS, in this case around 160 to 70 FPS. So the website is saying that I have zero bottleneck at 1080p and zero bottleneck at 1440p. This cannot be the case, because for that to happen, we will need to have the exact same frame rate at both resolutions, which is not the case here. We see how 1440p is affecting the final FPS. So how is this website being able to state that is something that I'm really not sure how do they get to those conclusions. Now the interesting part here is that if I limit the game to 60 FPS, as you can see at 1440p, we are only using around 45 to 50% of the GPU and less than 10% the CPU. In this case, we are not having any sort of bottleneck by any of the two main components that the website is testing. This is how the game will play if you had a 1440p 60 Hz monitor. So you are not being bottlenecked in any case by the GPU or the CPU. The worst case scenario, your bottleneck is the monitor, but for your purpose there is none. So how is the calculation being done? It can be done only by CPU and GPU. If we play a 4K Nightmare DLSS performance, then the thing changes, because we go to around 80 to 90 FPS. Once again, they said it's only 16% bottleneck, which I don't understand what that means. But here, once again, the question is, if you were playing on a 120 Hz monitor at 4K and this quality, yes, you are not getting the most of your component and CPU and GPU and monitor. But if you were playing on a 4K 60 Hz monitor, the story changes, because you won't be able to saturate that, because at 60 FPS the GPU and CPU will still have more than enough room. Even using a game that is more CPU demanding, as in this case Starfield, we can see that even using 1080p low DLSS performance, ultra performance in this case I believe, we can still get the CPU to be fully utilized. However, even at such a low resolution and everything, we are now using around 50% CPU, which is a lot more than Doom. And the reason is because obviously the game uses more CPU, it's more demanding, so the requirements are completely different for Doom and for Starfield in this case, for example. Then once again we test the same way we did with Doom, with a completely different game. In this case is Dying Light 2, and we see that we are still GPU limited even at 10 at this resolution. But the thing that I'm trying to see is at least how much can we really get out of this CPU. We probably could get even more, but 200 FPS is enough for the testing we are trying to find out here. I should have put a 40, 70 or something like that just to see how far the CPU can get. But this is more than enough for our testing. Okay, so we know that we can get above 200 FPS easily. But the moment we put the game at 1080p, we go under 100. We're losing more than half the frames that we were having before, and this means that the CPU is not as utilized as before because the GPU is still our main factor limitation. So once again, how is this website telling you there is no bottleneck when there is clearly is? But there is clearly a bottleneck at 1080p on Ultra if you're trying to play this above 60 FPS, because if your monitor is a 60 Hz monitor, there is no point on playing at 90 FPS in this case. So you will not be bottlenecked either by your CPU or GPU, and you will be enjoying the game at a very good quality, in this case 1080p Ultra, and we are not using ray tracing. If we use ray tracing, we will have more CPU utilization but also lower frame rate at this GPU. So that means again that there is a bottleneck now caused by the ray tracing activation. So there is a lot of factor to take into consideration when calculating bottlenecks, because if you see here, now we are playing a 4K at 60 FPS. Once again, if you have a 4K monitor with only 60 Hz, this is more than enough, and you will not be bottlenecked by GPU or CPU, which again, where that the 16% thing comes, we have no idea. And this is the point I'm trying to make here, is that now we have to play a low, because if we go Ultra, we go under the 60 FPS. So once again, so the 60 FPS bottleneck in this specific case comes from playing at Ultra instead of low. So how you actually calculate when there is a bottleneck? As you can see, there are many factors: monitor, configuration of the games, or even the GPU, CPU, and all of these have to be taken into consideration when you are going to be talking about bottleneck. It's not just about the components. Of course, as I said, if you go to the extremes, yes, there is, but when you are more balanced, the situation changes drastically. So as you saw, I can make a case for this or how it works. So because just to give you an example, I tested only 3 games. This was just to give you sort of an idea of what my point is. So when we play Doom Eternal, like at the lowest of the lowest, and the point of playing that at the lowest is to be or get close to what the CPU alone can get in terms of frames, we saw that playing at low, we can at the lowest resolution with DLSS performance to give the GPU the best chance, we were getting around 500 frames per second and around 300, 400 frames per second at high, right? So that we know that for a fact that this CPU can at least get to that, right? But the moment we put this game to 1080p, we lose like half the performance. We're losing half the performance no matter if we are using low or we are using high. So we're losing a lot of performance, right? So isn't that already a bottleneck there? Because we obviously are not getting as much frame as we could with the 13700K. If we had like an RTX 4080, we would probably get those 500 FPS. So the moment I'm using an RTX 2060 Super to play the Doom Eternal game at 1080p, we are already losing a lot of the possible frames I could have gotten with that CPU, because the GPU is not able to give me more frames. While we're using a 4080, I will have gotten all my 500 frames per second, right? So that's the first thing. So there is a clear bottleneck there, because the 2060 Super is not capable of delivering everything that the CPU is capable of. However, also while playing, we saw, well, but if my monitor is a 60 FPS, my bottleneck is the CPU, is the monitor. So it doesn't matter if they are not really well balanced, because in any case, I'm not getting the most of either the GPU or the CPU, because they are limited in what they can give me, and in this particular game. But also, if I am playing at certain resolutions quality, even if I had a 144 monitor at 1080p, I will not be able to achieve that sort of performance. But then if I'm playing at 4K, then I'm still limited, because now all I want to achieve is 60 FPS, which I know the CPU can do, because the CPU is able to get up to 500, but my GPU is not. But the fact is that because I'm playing a 4K 60, even the GPU is okay doing that I want. So there is Is it really a bottleneck in the CPU GPU? Well, it depends on the situation, because even on Dying Light 2 we saw the fact that the GPU was causing to be the limiting factor in every case we were testing. But as always, it will depend a lot on what you're trying to do and how you want to play, because I am playing using DLSS performance just to give the GPU the best chance possible. And then we can find that even in that situation, the GPU was being a bottleneck. But this bottleneck is depending on what you're trying to achieve, because once again, if all you have is a 60 Hz monitor, then it doesn't matter if your GPU anyway or your CPU is not going to be able to take advantage of the GPU fully, because going fully with the GPU will mean that you're going to go over 60 Hz or 60 FPS, which in any case you cannot even enjoy, because you don't have a monitor that will give you that. So that bottleneck there doesn't really matter. Okay, now if you had a 4K 240 Hz OLED monitor, and then things will change. But then it will change if depending on what you're playing, because if you're playing Dota at low settings, maybe you're not losing anything, because the GPU and CPU are more than capable of giving you those 240 Hz. So this whole bottleneck situation is really complex, because it depends on the software you're using, on the quality you want to use. Are you playing with ray tracing or not? Are you playing with high, low, medium settings? So there is a lot to put into perspective here, because sometimes you can get away with a lower tier CPU if you're playing like a 4K 60, because that's your goal. So sometimes it pays to just go not so high on the CPU, but much higher on the GPU, because you want to play a higher resolution, not higher frame rate. And that means your CPU doesn't need to be as powerful. So even an RTX 4090 at 4K can get saturated with an RX 6700 from AMD or an i5, because all you're trying to get is a 60 FPS, and your GPU is going to be your limiting factor in this case, because you 4K 60, you got there and you cannot get any more. So what's the point of putting a more powerful CPU? So if I'm telling you immediately, oh, is this CPU like an RX 7600 good for an RTX 4090, people would say immediately, oh no, they're unbalanced, there is going to be a bottleneck. But the reality is that if all I'm trying to do is achieve 60 FPS at 4K 90 because you don't like DLSS, then the RX 7600 is going to be enough for that, because the GPU is going to be the limiting factor. So there is no point on getting like a 7800 X3D, for example. There is absolutely no point, because you're not going to go over 60, or that's not your goal. And the same can go the other way if all you are trying to do is play like Dota at 2 or 360 FPS, but you don't need then a 4090, because if you're playing a 1080p, probably even a 2080 or a 3060 Ti or anything around those lines are going to be more than enough. And what you need in this case to get all those frames is more CPU. So you can get like a 7800 X3D with like an RTX 3060 Ti and probably get 360 FPS on Dota or Counter-Strike or something. I don't know, I don't play those games, so I don't know exactly the needs of GPU that they have, but I think what I'm trying to explain is more than clear enough in this case. So as you see, these websites are completely useless, and the complexities of the bottleneck problem are more than that, and it's not just dependent on a specific combination of hardware, GPU and CPU. It also will depend on the monitor, the frame rate you want to achieve, the resolution, the game, and how you're playing those, and what are you playing. All of these have to be taken together in order to build sort of a balanced system depending on your own needs, okay? Because for somebody, and this is completely out of gaming, editing video, he doesn't really need like a super fast GPU maybe, but he will need a lot of RAM. So maybe he has an RTX 4090 and a Threadripper, but then he has only like 16 gigs of RAM. And that is going to be the bottleneck, because then everything has to be work on on swap or hard drive, or he doesn't have NVMe drive and using HD. And so all of these things have to be taken. Well, maybe he will do much better having 256 gigabytes of VRAM and NVMe, and maybe a lower CPU, not a Threadripper, and maybe a lower GPU, like, I don't know, even a 3060 or something, but those other components are more important in his specific case. So what I'm trying to say here is, at the end of the day, is these websites are useless. You should not be using it, and each case of bottleneck has to be studied case by case, because unless you're going to the extreme, the other ways of combination are not so clear and cut. Hope you like this video, and as usual, see you on the next one.